Hi, I'm Saya and today I'm at the cosplay shop not to make this sword, but to make the gauntlet and the pauldron to finish the entire build of the Cloud costume. Welcome to the cosplay shop. Alright, so today I'm going to be working on Cloud. I'm actually going to start with his pauldron and his arm gauntlet. So for the pauldron, I drew up a little pattern, and for the gauntlet, I just wrapped a little duct tape form of my forearm. But I'm going to be making this bigger because you can tell there's a gap between Cloud's glove and gauntlet. So I'll be tracing that foam. Cut it out and then we'll come back to you. So to transfer this pattern onto foam, I tend to use a paint marker instead of a Sharpie, because I feel like the foam damages Sharpies too much, and I just find this easier. So I transferred my patterns into 5mm EVA foam. I used the low density. You can use the high density, but to me, for pauldrons, it doesn't really matter. And then I used a pair of scissors to just cut everything out. So what I'm going to do is add 2 pieces of mousse into this gauntlet so that it sits better against my arm. What I'm also going to do is trace out the outer layers of the pauldron on 5mm foam again. This is because in the reference you can see that the pauldron is a bit thicker around the edge, and this also gives it a little bit more sturdiness. So as you can see, I added the extra bits on the inside. It gives me a bit of stability, but as you can see, it's still flimsy. It's not keeping its shape. If I were to heat shape it, it would lose its shape because it's only 5mm foam. So what I'm going to do, first I want to flatten this curve a bit. So I'm going to insert this piece of foam against the seam. So you press it flat. And as you can see, it's already flattened this curve a lot more. And what I want to do now is do the same, but shape it this way. I am cutting up these little foam dowels and adding a thick thread to them to create the illusion of screws. And I'm just gluing this with Instacure. I punched some holes out of Warbler, added that as rivets, and then I sealed up my 2 seams with Quick Seal. To prime this baby, I'm going to use Flexi Paint. I picked the black one, just so then I have a nice base color and then I don't have to paint it black. And I like to use a flat brush, that's easiest. So what you're going to do is just dip your brush and then dip into the Flexi Paint. You don't have to thin your Flexi Paint just by dipping the brush and then in the Flexi Paint. This is enough. And we're gonna do about 3 to 4 layers of this. So the advantage of using Flex Paint is that you have a primer and paint in one go, which is perfect for lazy people like me. If you use Flexi Paint, make sure you finish your project pretty quickly, because if you leave it in your room for 2 weeks, it's gonna attract dust and it's gonna be very difficult to finish. So after covering our armor with 3 layers of Flexi Paint, I'm going to add the silver highlights. I'm going to be using the aluminium powder in silver. Because I'll only be using a little, I don't need a mask, but if you're gonna do an entire armor with this kind of power, maybe it's best to wear a mask, because this is very fine. And if you sneeze, it gets everywhere. This is the kind of stuff you'll find in your bathtub 3 days later. So to add this onto the armor, the flexi paint is a little bit sticky, which will actually help us. And I'm going to be using a powder brush or a contouring brush or whatever. This is just a fluffy makeup brush. It's very easy to pick up too much powder, so I just get a little bit on my brush and tap off the excess. You can add a ton of silver, but then you will end up with a very shiny piece of armor. So I'm adding a little bit more powder onto the screws to give it a more metallic effect. Basically, you can play around with this, but less is more. Like, don't dump the whole pot on there. Just work your way up to more shiny. If you dip a finer brush into the powder and pick up a little bit more, you can add these lines just to add a little bit more texture, a little bit more battle damage, as you might call it. To add a little bit more weathering to it, I'm just grabbing some brown acrylic and just dry brushing that on there. So as you can see, I finished the pauldron. I did the same for the gauntlet. Also adding more brown in the middle because this part is supposed to be leather. You could add even more shading, but this is how I like to shade it. If you really want some stark highlights, just grab a silver Sharpie and you can just simply add highlights to the corners or to the middle, wherever you want, just with a silver Sharpie. Just to show you guys, I have a little piece of scrap foam here with 2 layers of flexi paint. I used a little amount of powder on my armor, but if you go wild with this stuff, you can create very shiny armor. If you ever want to make something really light up, just add more powder. Because of the flexi paint, it will stick to it. Just dip off any excess and you will have a very nice metallic effect. So for Cloud's belt, I actually took a sheet of 2mm foam and drew out the basic shape. Then I transferred this onto leather so I could sew my upper seam and flip the leather so I could really get the foam very close to the edge and get a nice finish. Then I'm gonna draw the emblem onto a piece of paper and actually attach this paper onto the belt and then sew on top of it. Because of the foam, you will have a bit of a 3D effect coming through, and the paper you can just rip off after you've sewn the emblem on. If you have some fuss left over from the paper like I do here, you can always just grab a Sharpie and color it a bit and nobody will know. If you don't want to use a Sharpie, you can always use paint and even add some highlights to the emblem to give it a more aged look. So if you want to make a tank top for Cloud, just grab a shirt that fits you. I have some leeway here because this fabric is a little bit stretchy. So you just copy that shirt onto your fabric and keep in mind to cut out extra seam allowance. And once you have cut out your shirt, make sure that you grab one side of the shirt and cut the collar a bit lower. Otherwise, you're just gonna choke into your shirt. So once you have your pattern for your tank top, simply sew the sides together, sew the shoulders together, and for his collar, I'm just gonna sew a tube and attach it to this and then roll it up so you get that thick collar look. So I finished the symbol on the front of the belt. I also added some strapping to the back. It simply opens and closes with Velcro. And then I added these little loops for our harness. These are just super glued on. And now we're gonna start working on the harness. What we're going to do is fold these on themselves to actually add the strapping. But as you can see, this doesn't look very good. And I would also like to have my strapping a little bit flexible, so I'm not really constricted in my movement. So what I'm going to do is I would like this to be around this big, is cut here. And then we're going to flip this part and add a little bit of elastic in between. And if we do this, as you can see, I will have a little bit of elastic here, and we're going to attach this with Velcro, but because of that, this strap will not be as rigid and will be more flexible in case you move around a lot. And then I'll add a little circle of Worbla on top to make a fake rivet, and we're gonna do this 3 times. We're doing this with Velcro, but if I were to sew my Velcro onto this, it will show on the other side. So what we're going to do is actually super glue to it, but because the back of Velcro isn't very good to hold super glue, I'm actually going to sew this onto a little piece of fabric, snip off the fabric, and then put super glue onto this and onto the back of our leather, and this will keep it together, just because this does not hold super glue. So I finished my 3 straps. For the left strap, I also added the wider piece we had made before. And now all that's left to do is connect these together. I made a little piece out of foam and Worbla. So now we're just gonna super glue this. So now that we finished all the little bits of the costume, it's time to put everything on. So this is the entire finished costume. It was really interesting to be working with foam and getting such a good result with the aluminium powder. I'm really happy with this. Also, the pauldron weighs nothing. So I'm really comfortable in this. It's very easy to just pop it off and take it with you in transport. Other than that, leather is always a challenge, so take your time with that. And I hope you enjoyed the build of this costume. See you in the next one.